Welcome back, deep divers. Ready for a story that's, well, a little sticky.
Sticky is right, and surprisingly tragic.
Today's deep dive is going to take us back to 1919, Boston, January 15th.
Sounds pretty normal so far.
Oh, it starts normal enough, but trust me, things get messy. Fast. We're talking the Great Boston Molasses Flood.
A flood of molasses. Not your typical natural disaster.
Not at all, but it was a disaster nonetheless.
Right.
And it all starts with this, well, gigantic tank.
The Purity Distilling Company, they had this massive tank.
Massive being an understatement, I'm guessing.
Oh, yeah. 50 feet tall, 90 feet across. Can you imagine that thing?
Whoa, that's bigger than my house. What were they even doing with that much molasses?
Well, you got to remember, this was during World War I. Molasses was kind of a big deal back then.
Really? For baking war cakes?
Not quite. It was actually a key ingredient in making ethanol.
Ethanol, like for fuel.
Fuel, and, some adult beverages, too. But the big thing was munitions production. Ethanol was vital for that.
So this giant tank, it was basically holding wartime supplies.
In a way, yeah. And that's where the problem starts. You see, this tank, it wasn't exactly built for, holding something under that much pressure.
Pressure from the molasses.
Yeah, from the molasses itself, but also from the way it was, fermented. That process creates carbon dioxide, you see, and that adds to the pressure inside the tank.
So they had this giant tank filled with a substance that's literally trying to explode outward, and it wasn't designed to handle it.
Pretty much. Plus, there were some construction issues, let's say.
Construction issues, like what?
Well, it had leaked from day one. There
Mhm.
were reports of groaning noises coming from it. People even saw cracks in the metal.
And they just ignored it.
While some people say the company just hoped for the best, others think they were so focused on meeting wartime demands that they, cut some corners.
Either way, sounds like a recipe for disaster. Literally.
Oh, it gets worse. The weather in Boston that January was all over the place. One day it was freezing, the next it was warm. And molasses, well, it reacts to those temperature changes.
So when it got warm,
The molasses would expand, creating even more pressure inside that already stressed tank.
so you have this giant, poorly built tank filled to the brim with molasses that's expanding and contracting with the weather. What could possibly go wrong?
Well, on January 15th, 1919, at around 12:30 p.m., we found out the tank ruptured.
Ruptured, you mean like exploded?
In a way, yeah. It wasn't an explosion like a bomb, but it was sudden, violent. Witnesses said it sounded like a roar, like thunder. And then this wave of molasses, 25 feet high, just surged through the streets.
The 25-foot wave
Of
moving at 35 miles an hour.
Can you imagine that?
That's faster than I can run. That's terrifying.
Absolutely terrifying. And it was incredibly destructive.
Mhm.
This wave, it was thick, heavy, way more so than water. It smashed into buildings, bent steel, even tossed a streetcar right off its tracks.
Oh, wow. This is starting to sound less like a sticky mess and more like, I don't know, molasses tsunami.
That's a pretty good description, actually.
So what happened to, the people who were in the path of this molasses tsunami?
Chaos. Absolute chaos. It was like something out of a nightmare. People were swept away, knocked off their feet. Buildings collapsed around them.
Oh my gosh. So what happened then? Was anyone able to help?
Well, as you can imagine, the rescue efforts were a bit unusual. I mean, how do you even begin to deal with a flood of molasses?
I can't even imagine. It's not like you can just swim in it.
Exactly. It's thick, sticky. You get trapped. People were literally drowning in molasses. It was awful.
So how did they even start to rescue people?
It was a massive effort. The Boston Police, the Red Cross, Army, and Navy personnel, everyone rushed to the scene.
So it was a real all hands on deck situation.
Oh, absolutely. They used ropes, ladders. Some even dove right into that sticky mess to try and pull people out.
That must have taken incredible bravery. I mean, to jump into, well, a sea of molasses, that's amazing.
It really was. And then you had these 116 cadets from the USS Nantucket, a training ship docked nearby. They were some of the first on the scene.
Wow, those young cadets thrown right into this incredibly sticky situation.
Yeah, and they just jumped right in, helping to pull survivors out, giving first aid. They were really instrumental in the rescue efforts.
It's incredible to think about all these people coming together in the face of such a bizarre and frankly horrifying disaster. Were they able to rescue everyone?
Tragically, no. 21 people lost their lives in the flood, plus several horses.
Oh my goodness, that's so sad.
It really was a terrible tragedy. And some of the victims were actually swept right out into Boston Harbor by the force of that molasses wave. It took days to recover everyone.
Wow. So not only did they have to rescue people from this thick molasses, but they also had to, search the harbor.
Absolutely. And then came the cleanup. That was a whole other nightmare.
I bet. How do you even begin to clean up millions of gallons of molasses?
It took weeks. Hundreds of people worked around the clock. They used fireboats spraying salt water to try and break down the molasses, tons and tons of sand to absorb it.
That's, it's hard to even fathom the scale of it.
And they say the harbor was stained brown with molasses all the way until summer.
It's really amazing how the people of Boston came together to deal with this. It must have been just, I don't know, overwhelming. But I'm curious about the aftermath. Did the company face any consequences for this disaster?
Oh, yeah, definitely. This tragedy actually led to one of the very first class action lawsuits in Massachusetts history.
A class action lawsuit.
You see, back then, the idea that a large group of people could band together and sue a single defendant was pretty novel. But this case, it really helped pave the way for modern corporate regulations and liability laws.
So the Great Molasses Flood, it wasn't just a bizarre event. It actually had a major impact on legal history.
Exactly. It set a precedent for holding companies accountable for their negligence. So what was the company's defense in this case? Did they take responsibility?
Well, at first, they tried to blame it on anarchists.
Anarchists.
You heard that right.
Yeah.
They actually claimed that the tank was blown up by anti-war saboteurs because, some of the alcohol produced from the molasses was being used for munitions.
Oh, wow. I guess they thought, hey, why not throw out the craziest excuse we can think of?
Right. But of course, nobody believed that. I mean, it's molasses.
No, the investigation showed a pretty clear pattern of negligence on the company's part. They cut corners during construction, ignored all the warning signs, even tried to cover up the leaks with paint.
So they really were trying to hide the truth.
Yep. And in the end, the court-appointed auditor found them completely responsible for the disaster. They had to pay out over $628,000 in damages, which is something like, I don't know, $11 million today.
So justice was served, in a way.
Yeah.
But I'm still wondering what exactly caused the tank to fail. I mean, was it just bad construction or something else?
Well, for a long time, the exact cause was a bit of a mystery. But then in 2014, this team of engineers decided to take another look at the case using modern technology and analysis techniques. Kind of like a cold case investigation, but for a giant tank of molasses.
Okay, now I'm really intrigued. What did they find out?
Their findings were really fascinating. Turns out the steel used to build the tank was totally inadequate. It was way too thin and brittle for a structure that size. Didn't even meet the building codes of 1919.
Oh, even by the standards back then, they were cutting corners.
Big time. Plus, the rivets they used to hold the tank together were faulty and prone to cracking, which just made the whole thing weaker.
So you got these shoddy materials, the fluctuating temperatures, the pressure from the fermentation process. It's almost like they designed it to fail.
It really does seem that way. It's a classic example of prioritizing profit over safety.
What a terrible tragedy.
Yeah.
But I have to ask, what was the long-term impact on the North End community? Did they ever really recover from this, this sticky situation?
The North End, they're a tough bunch. They rebuilt, of course. But something like that, it leaves a mark.
Yeah, I bet. Not just the physical damage, but I mean, emotionally, too.
You're right. I mean, imagine living through that. The sights, the sounds.
And the smell. I read that the smell of molasses lingered for years.
It did. Think about it. Your home, your streets, everything coated in molasses. The smell would get into everything. It must have been a constant reminder of that awful day.
Like a phantom smell haunting the neighborhood. Wow.
It really does make you think, doesn't it? Beyond the physical damage, the injuries, the loss of life, there's this whole other layer of trauma for the entire community.
Yeah. And it wasn't just the emotional impact. I mean, the molasses flood, it disrupted everything. Businesses, transportation, just daily life in the North End.
Absolutely. It's a reminder that disasters, they don't just happen in isolation. The effects, they ripple outwards, impacting every aspect of a community.
It's so easy to just focus on the big picture of an event like this. But we have to remember, there were real people whose lives were changed forever by this.
You're absolutely right. Behind the statistics, the headlines, there are individual stories of loss, of resilience, of courage. Those stories, those are what make history come alive.
Well said.
Yeah.
So is there anything, any kind of memorial or monument to remember the victims of the molasses flood?
There is. A small plaque. It's in Langone Park, which is actually where the tank used to stand. It lists the names of those who died and serves as a reminder of the lessons we learned from that day.
It's good that there's something to remember them by. And to, I guess, remind us that something like this could happen again.
You know, it's funny, molasses. It seems so harmless, right? But when you really think about it, so many things around us, things we take for granted, they have the potential to be dangerous.
Yeah, it makes you think twice about that sticky bun, doesn't it?
Uh-huh. Maybe just a little.
Well, on that note, I think we've come to the end of our deep dive into the Great Boston Molasses Flood. It's certainly been a sticky journey,
It really has.
but I hope you learned something new today, maybe gained a new perspective on history, and who knows, maybe even a newfound respect for the power of molasses.
And if there's one takeaway from all this, it's that we should never underestimate the importance of safety, responsible engineering, and holding companies accountable for their actions.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Hmm.
And who knows, maybe this will inspire you to do your own deep dive into some other lesser-known disasters. You never know what sticky situations you might uncover.
Happy exploring.
Until next time, deep divers.